Well, welcome everyone to an extraordinary Being Human event, and a special welcome to our panel here who are here to debate the big question, are genes deep history? We're going to talk about what ancient DNA can and cannot tell us about the past and about ourselves. Or to put it another way, our subject is Cheddar Man and all that. We've got 2 hours, and in the second half, those of you looking in will have a chance to question and challenge some of the leading researchers in this field. But first, I'm going to ask each of the panel to explain a particular area of their expertise as we discuss fossils, genetics, archaeology, people, and the world around us. As I introduce them, I'd like you all to answer a simple question in one sentence, please, which is, what single advance or discovery in human genetic history has most surprised you? I'll start with Professor Chris Stringer. He's a research leader in human origins at the Natural History Museum in London. His ideas about where we come from have been highly influential, and he's directed major projects investigating ancient humans in Britain. Chris, perhaps for those of us of a certain age, one of the most surprising things about ancient genetics is that it exists at all.
Yes, absolutely. Obviously, I go back into the distant past in terms of research on human origins. And yes, for most of that time, the evidence was bones and stones, basically, from the Paleolithic and fossil remains, of course. And so the idea that we would one day have genetic material from the fossils, it was something that most of us never considered would be possible. And of course, there was work on recent DNA, where people had used recent DNA to try and track back in human evolution. So we have the famous paper in 1987 by Can, Stoneking and Wilson, where they looked at modern human mitochondrial DNA around the world. And then they used a computer program to reconstruct its evolutionary history, which suggested that there was a single female ancestor for all modern humans that lived in Africa perhaps 200,000 years ago.
Okay.
And that, of course, was a sensation at the time. It was one of the beginnings of what we call now out of Africa in terms of recent human evolution. But of course, it was only a tiny bit of, they weren't looking even at the whole mitochondrial genome. They were looking at bits of it. And it was highly controversial. And of course, their prediction could not be tested by looking at the real fossils.
Okay, Chris, I'm going to jump in because I've given you quite a long sentence. We'll get on to the discussion in a couple of minutes, but let's just go through. Let's just go through the panel. Dr. Adam Rutherford next is a geneticist, writer, and broadcaster who teaches the history of race science and genetics at UCL. His books include a brief history of everyone who ever lived, which was based on the premise that each of us carries the story of our species in our genomes. So Adam, in a sentence, what was your great genetic surprise?
Well, I think the one that Chris was probably getting to was going to be mine, which was a question that had been outstanding in from the 19th century onwards, which was what was the relationship between the Neanderthals and Homo sapiens? A question that has existed for a long time, and then was beginning to be answered. I'm doing what Chris did, aren't I? I'm giving a very long answer. So
yeah, I was expecting the question to be what was the single most surprising thing. So that's what threw me. Yeah. Yes.
So if you're going with the definitive evidence that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred and they are our ancestors, am I right in saying that, Chris?
Yes, I mean, they are partly our ancestors, yes. So we have an ancestry partly Neanderthal, some of us, partly Denisovan, some of us, yes.
Yeah. So if that's Chris's most surprising, definitive answer that ancient DNA has managed to give us, then the what followed were details and further surprises, and things like a couple of years ago, the discovery of not just a hybrid between Denisovans and Neanderthals, which I suppose would have been expected, but that we actually have the capability to find a first generation, an F1, the daughter of, I think it was a daughter of the hybridization of a Denisovan and Neanderthal. But I'm going to go one step further, which is, I think, one of the things that impressed me most in the last 3 or 4 years, rather than the last 10 or 12 years since we've been doing this, is our ability now to pull DNA out of not the bones, the ancient fossilized bones of hominids or other organisms that lived in the past, but actually the dirt in the cave floors, the environmental DNA that remained from where those creatures resided. And we don't know whether they were because it was possibly a dung pile, or where, you know, an organism died there. But now, you know, some of the work of people like Svante Pääbo and S.K. Villerslev and the huge teams that they work in means that we can go to caves where we think animals and humans and various types of humans once lived, dig around in the dirt and manage to demonstrate that they were there indeed by getting DNA out of the ground. I think that's pretty special.
I agree. I think DNA from sediments is extraordinary, and the possibilities when you start thinking about it open up to an extraordinary new world that's lying out there waiting for us to explore. Okay, thanks, Adam. Dr. Tom Booth is Senior Laboratory Research Scientist at the Ancient Genomics Lab at the Crick Institute in London. He was the first to find evidence for mummification in prehistoric Britain and is studying the science and ethics of genome sequencing from excavated remains. So Tom, what surprised you?
The risk of, certainly repeating Adam and Chris's points about Denisovan's sedimentary DNA, and the fact that the field exists at all. I mean, even not going that far back, when I was an undergraduate in the sort of 15 years ago or so, ADNA was so much on its arse in a way, because no one could really get past the contamination issues. There was lots of questions about authenticity and the power of what you could do, and the change that there's been in such a short space of time has been astronomical. But for me personally, I think the most interesting thing has been, or the most surprising thing is not just the amount of human diversity in the past in terms of archaic hominins, but also the amount of genetic diversity there was in the past just in modern humans. And so particularly working on the fact that sort of people who have recent ancestry in Britain are closer genetically to people from the Indian subcontinent than they are to the people who lived in Britain during the Mesolithic, and that the people who lived in Britain during the Mesolithic genetically don't exist anymore, that their genetic variation is in an unmixed form, that their genetic variation has largely disappeared. So I think that diversity of human populations in the past, not just archaic humans, is the most surprising thing for me.
So the speed at which the science has progressed and the diversity which it's revealing.
Exactly, yeah.
Professor Joanna Brück is head of the School of Archaeology at University College Dublin. Among her many interests is how people treated the human body in Bronze Age Britain and Ireland. And she's concerned with what ancient DNA can say, or perhaps not, about ethnic identities and kinships. Jo, welcome to the group. Once again, ancient genetics came onto the scene. What most shook you up?
Well, I'm an archaeologist and not a geneticist. And I suppose what surprised me most was how quickly long discredited assumptions about the relationship between genetic ancestry and aspects of social identity, particularly ethnicity, resurfaced both in the media and among academic archaeologists. And I suppose we had become used to, as archaeologists, talking about how identity is the outcome of social practices. It's socially constructed. But then there was a sudden shift to conversations which seemed to be emerging where identity was assumed to be determined by genetic ancestry. And that seemed somehow to me quite problematic and quite surprising. It seemed to be quite a relapse towards fairly outdated ways of understanding people and how societies work.
So it's the impact on traditional archaeology that has really been disruptive.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've been a little bit surprised as to how quickly we've gone back to quite problematic ways of thinking that had been really taken apart, over the last several decades.
Sure we'll be talking more about that later this evening. And finally, Subhadra Das. She was, until recently, science collections curator at UCL, and is a writer, historian, broadcaster, and, it says here, comedian. She focuses her research on the history of 19th and 20th century eugenics and scientific racism. Subhadra, welcome. Has anything particularly surprised you about what's happening in evolution and genetics?
Yeah, so again, caveat, not a geneticist, and Joe has preempted me slightly as well. So I'll try and be concise and say, I think the thing that continues to surprise me is both the size, although it is closing, but nonetheless the persistence of the gap between what we think genes can tell us and what they can actually tell us. Convenient, really, for this event.
Right, and that's something we're going to address. Thank you. Okay, so Chris, it's your chance to say a bit more. Let's go back to you. And as you formed some of your key ideas about our origins on the evidence of fossils, of course, there was no such thing really in the field as DNA and genetics that we could work with. And what strikes me is that ancient DNA is making the scene much more complicated, but it hasn't replaced bone anatomy. So why do the fossils themselves matter? What do they tell us?
Well, as we've already heard, of course, genes can't just be translated into morphology. We can't reconstruct a Neanderthal, even with its complete genome. We can't reconstruct a modern human, even with its complete genome. So the fossils are always going to be important because they are physical evidence of the anatomy of people in the past. And not only that, of course, they've got information on them as well about the functional anatomy, how these bodies worked as a unit in these ancient people. We can use them to look inside the skull. We can look inside at the ear bones. Things like this you just can't get from DNA evidence. And these are important in terms of, we can use the ear bones of a Neanderthal to reconstruct the range of its hearing, for example, compared with ours. We can't get that from DNA. And on those fossils, of course, you may have additional information about human behavior. There might be cut marks on the bones, of course, suggesting some kind of ritual treatment or maybe cannibalism. There could be calculus on the teeth. Within the bones, there will be things like isotopes, which can be used to help to reconstruct diet and location. We, of course, have the possibility of proteins coming out of bones as well as DNA now with proteomics. So there's a lot more from the fossils. And of course, when we get to the behavior, no amount of Neanderthal DNA can tell us whether they buried their dead or whether they were painting on cave walls. So, I think the fossil evidence and, of course, the archaeological evidence is never going to be replaced by DNA. But working together, of course, we can make new reconstructions of human history and prehistory.
I think you've raised some interesting issues there that I think I'd like to ask some of the more geneticist specialists in the group later on about. But also, I think you raised a very important point that not only are the fossils important, but the archaeology is important as well, and the things people made and did, and the environments around them that we can learn from other parts of the archaeological record. But what I find interesting is that essentially you and colleagues a few decades ago pieced together an evolutionary story for hominins after the break from the great apes. And although that picture has got wildly more complicated, nonetheless, the basic structure is still there. And so there's something in the fossils alone that gave you the ability to summarize our evolutionary history.
Yes, obviously different people, even from the fossils, read that history in different ways. But from my point of view, yes, there's no doubt we are a single species today. And for me, that can be picked up in our skeletons with shared features across all humans today. For example, a high rounded brain case and a chin on the lower jaw. These are features we can look for in the fossil record. And the work I did starting in the 1970s and then the 1980s really tried to trace where that pattern originated. And for me, the evidence was that It appeared first in Africa and then later on in other parts of the world. So that was the beginning of my view of a recent African origin. And as you say, you know, in those days, it was a very simple story. And we used to believe in these single, you know, lines of evolution. For some people, it was a march of progress with modern humans at the top, you know, and all the other humans striving to be like us. So there was that perspective in there, which we know was wrong too. And now instead, with both the fossils and the DNA, we see this incredible diversity. You know, even in the last 70,000 years, at least 5 kinds of humans around on the earth. Us, having evolved in Africa, the Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, the Denisovans over in East Asia, the Hobbit, Homo floresiensis, this strange thing on Flores, and Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. Now that diversity again is astonishing, and most of it we've only learnt about in the last 10 or 15 years. So yeah, the fossils have made things more complex, and the DNA adding even greater complexity. Yeah, I mean, I gave a half-hour talk yesterday on human evolution, and it gets more and more difficult to sort of summarize where we are with some of the big issues because there's so much complexity.
Do you think that the presence of ancient DNA in the field has actually encouraged people, you know, archaeologists in particular, people who aren't involved in the DNA research, to more actively seek out fossils?
I don't think so. I mean, I think people have always been aware of the fossil evidence, and hopefully the fossil workers have always been aware of searching for the archaeological evidence. Sometimes, of course, you know, people have their priorities when they're excavating sites, of course, but both lots of evidence are important. So I think particularly now, and Adam's mentioned cave sediment DNA, I mean, that's going to bring together a lot of this different evidence, because there, in a cave like Denisova Cave, you know, they took something like 700 cave sediment samples. 24% of those samples through 300,000 years had hominin traces in them. I mean, it's just unbelievable, the amount of evidence that will be there. And dozens of species of mammals represented in the sediment DNA. So 1 teaspoon of cave sediment can have dozens of different species represented in it. So this will affect the way anyone excavates a site in the future. I think certainly for the later Pleistocene, when you can have DNA recovery, I think everyone now must plan their excavation from the beginning, assuming there could be DNA in the cave sediments, and planning their work accordingly.
Okay, so Chris, as Chris says, we can actually almost dig up DNA now. So, and I think we do need to get on to what DNA is, and this is where Adam comes in. You've done, Adam, a great job of writing and broadcasting about both fossils and archaeology, and about ancient and modern DNA. You've described DNA as a new way to read our past. Tell us how that works.
Yeah, sometimes when I talk about this, I sort of stumble because I make what was initially a genuine mistake, and now has become a sort of comedic mistake, which is that to describe our DNA as a record of every sexual encounter that our ancestors ever had. That isn't what DNA is. It's a record of every successful reproductive sexual encounter that our ancestors have ever had. And those two things are different, it turns out. But in the sense of the basics of how DNA works, how it codes for pieces of information, pieces of biological information, we do carry, in a sense that needs to be heavily caveated and sort of understood through the lens of, you know, really understanding the basics of genetics, carries the history of our species, and not just our species, but the species from which we are descended, and indeed all life on Earth. And that's because we all exist on, or all creatures on Earth exist on the same biological family tree, according to the rules as first explained by Darwin in the 1850s. So we have this record in every cell, right? We have this record of what our parents' genes were like, and what their parents' genes were like, and so on back through time. Now, I think a really, really important aspect of this whole conversation, which I think everyone has alluded to on the panel so far, but I think it's really worth spelling out and really, really sort of nailing down, are the limits to that information, the limits to what DNA can actually bring forwards, not just in terms of retrieving it from ancient bones, but analysing our own DNA that we carry in ourselves today. Now, what I mean by that is, when this first started to emerge in sort of 2000, I don't know, the 2007s, 8s, and then the big Neanderthal finds in 2009, and then the Denisovans in 2010, and since then the whole field has gone completely nuts, and it's brilliant. It's been absolutely wonderful to be part of a continual revolution in our understanding of not just our species, but our ancestors, our sister and cousin species, and so on, all the stuff that we love talking about. But I think initially, what I experienced as a professional science communicator who specializes in evolution and genetics is that there was immediately a massive sort of over-reliance or over-interpretation of what genetics could tell us. And that feeds into a sort of long history that Subhadra alluded to when she, in her first question, which is the sort of significance of innate biology, of what we sometimes describe as nature rather than nurture. And it's all wedded to sort of long outdated but very, very human senses of biological essentialism, that we are programmed effectively to be in a certain way, and that genes can tell you what you are destined to be like. And that extends from in the popular discourse, and sometimes in the academic discourse as well, to that translating to, you know, physical characteristics, traits, things which are heavily politicized, such as pigmentation and eye color. And I know we will talk about that with regards to Jediman, as you alluded to at the beginning, and Tom is a big part of that story. But behavioral traits as well. And one thing that I don't think anyone in academic genetics anticipated was the sudden emergence of the commercial ancestry business, which did two things simultaneously. It made people very interested in genetics. Great, we want that as much as possible. And it also, I argue in lots of my work, that it contributed to a long outdated view of what DNA can tell us about ourselves. A sort of genetic essentialism that, you know, if it turns out after you've spat in a tube and sent your spit off to 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and they send you back a map of where you came from, right? Well, you know what? There isn't actually a scientific way of doing that. There's tons of caveats within that. There's tons of assumptions. And in fact, most of those companies are pretty good at saying, if you look at the small print, what you can actually discern from your DNA and what you can discern about your ancestry from your DNA. But you know what? Most people don't look at that. And most people don't have PhDs in population genetics, and therefore find it either uninteresting or hard to pass that information. And so I found in the last 10 years a massive recapitulation of ideas that in academic genetics we were moving away from for the last 20 or 30 or longer years, where, you know, oh, look, my 23andMe says I've got 20% Spanish or 10% Ashkenazi Jewish or 3% Swedish. And that explains why I'm, what did I say? Sort of hot-tempered, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. What was the other one? Doesn't matter, right? None of those things are true. This is what Chris was alluding to in his first answer, right? The relationship between genotype, what our DNA is, what the code actually spells out, and phenotype, how that manifests in a physical body, in our behavior. Those two things are really, really difficult to connect. I mean, not impossible, but pretty much the hardest question that we face in genetics. So we've got this new historical source text, and there was immediate fetishization of it. We could answer all of these questions all of a sudden. This is the sort of narrative that was emerging 10 or 12 years ago. And it wasn't true, right? It wasn't true at all. I definitely experienced a lot of geneticists who suddenly became historians by default, who weren't very good historians or archaeologists, and assumed that our data, which is molecular and therefore precise, was basically better than the other ways of knowing the past. And it's not. It's another source. It's a historical source. It is neither better nor worse than genealogical records or old bones or you know, archaeology or historical records or whatever. It has to sit alongside all those things, and we interpret the evidence in toto. And that's why geneticists, I mean, I said this in the Being Human event on Wednesday with Sarah Churchill, that's why I think scientists have to be better historians rather than historians becoming better geneticists.
I mean, I think that the thing about the ancient genetics in particular is that it's just bringing a huge amount of new and completely unexpected information into the field. And so the power of that information is potentially absolutely huge. And part of our challenge, if you like, at the moment is actually working out exactly what that can deliver for us, how that can help us understand the past, and how it cannot. And within archaeology, I think it's very helpfully making us question some of the ways we've relied on our archaeological evidence to tell us things about humanity, and to question, you know, how our processes work. So I think that there's a lot of questioning as well as understanding and learning to look forward to. And I think that the whole debate is going to be hugely productive.
Was that directed at me, or I think an archaeologist should answer that, and I think
yes, okay. Well, let's lead on. Thank you, Adam. Let's lead on to an archaeologist, and Tom actually has a unique perspective of someone who's trained as an archaeologist at one of our leading archaeology departments, and it's being threatened with closure, and is now working in a DNA lab. So he's got two hats here, and I thought, as an archaeologist with geneticists working around you, with both hats on, what most excites you or bothers you about current research in this field? Tom.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of what excites me, I think it's that we're really, this field has expanded so quickly that we're still really scratching the surface to some extent of what we're going to be able to find out. And it's not as if when this technology came along, there was suddenly lots of appropriate methods in which to analyze the data. Sort of, there's this, to some extent, almost arms race between the data that's being produced and the ways in which we can analyze it. And sort of every couple of months, there's a new method of looking at the ancient DNA data that can tell us new things. And, you know, that those more and more sophisticated methods are coming out with increasing frequency in terms of how to interrogate the ancient DNA data. So there's things like, I mean, particularly what we've been seeing on the horizon more recently is rather than what ancient DNA people were doing previously, is identifying very close relatives up to around cousins, so third degree relatives, first cousins, is that they're now using these techniques which can identify much more distant genetic relatives of people. And this isn't necessarily to look at with the expectation, sort of going back to Joe's point, that there's going to be a social relationship between these distant relatives. So you're talking about things like fourth, fifth cousins. But just that this gives you, that kind of thing will give you a perspective on the sort of long-term networks between different parts of the world. So if you're identifying lots of, you know, fourth cousins in the Bronze Age, for instance, between sort of Britain and northern France, for instance, that's telling you that there's sort of over the period of time when those people existed, there must have been some intimate marriage connections between those two areas. And that can also, then we can sort of understanding that there's that kind of reproductive interaction going on between those places over the long term, we can now think about how that might be expressed in the archaeological record, or whether the archaeological record reflects that at all. And increasingly, that kind of level of resolution is going to get better and better. I mean, essentially, if people are familiar with the genetic ancestry testing, where you kits where you get matched up with particular relatives, that is essentially the future of ancient is that you're going to be able to identify lots and lots of DNA relatives in the archaeological record, even when they're very distant. In terms of frustrating things about the field, I mean, this does go back to, again, what Adam was saying, what Joe was saying, is, the sort of, sometimes unintentional, maybe sometimes intentional, sort of chauvinism, DNA chauvinism that's emerged out of this field. And it's sort of unfortunate, expected, I suppose, but unfortunate that sort of genetic ancestry testing came around the same time that ancient DNA came about, because the two are sort of fused together in people's minds as Adam was saying, in a very deterministic way. And I don't think that's always helped by some of the researchers, the DNA researchers that works in these papers, and this is a frustrating thing, in not, as Joe says, engaging with the realities of social interaction, that for instance, that we can see these people's genetic ancestries as we define them, but the way in which they would have been aware of their genetic ancestry, particularly going into the distant of this, is the fact that in Britain during the Chalcolithic to Bronze Age, you have people moving into Britain who are carrying this type of ancestry called steppe ancestry, because it originates on the Pontic-Caspian steppe in Eastern Europe, and it's sort of brought in by migrations across Europe. So we can see, and we often describe, and geneticists often describe sort of steppe ancestry arriving in various places around the world, but the fact that the ancestry sort of those people in the Bronze Age came from the steppe sort of hundreds of years previously, the Pontic-Caspian steppe, probably, for all we know, meant nothing to them. They had absolutely no idea that they had any, people weren't wandering around in the past sort of carrying the 23andMe results around, showing people, look, I've got steppe ancestry, I've got this much steppe ancestry. And sometimes the way in which sometimes geneticists talk about it sort of deliberately or not, gives that kind of impression, and sort of hinges what sort of intimately connects these genetics and these cultural changes that we see in a very deterministic way, when as Joe was saying, you could question sort of how far people socially would have been aware of these sorts of things that we're looking at intimately. So we can see the patterns, but then in the genetic data, but how that actually relates to how people understood themselves is a much more difficult question. So in terms of the panel discussion, in terms of genes are to some extent deep history, but they aren't identity, whether that's in the modern world or in the past. I think that's a problem, as Adam was saying, because that kind of attitude that you get in genetics papers sometimes, of having these very tunnel vision about what the biological evidence says, and sort of not taking into account social factors that feature in the negotiation of social identity and kinship and genetics, means that people then just, who are really into this stuff, take the way that those papers have written and apply that to their data, and sort of only see genetics as the only way to define our modern identity today. And that's where you get sort of very problematic understandings of ethnicities and nationalities, and sort of it creates handholds for sort of far-right, alt-right ideologies to sort of take on advantage of in that respect.
I mean, I think it's worth remembering how new this field is and how fast things have progressed, and the way things are going to be changing and developing in substantially over the next decade, let's say. And I think, we can look to DNA. Tom, you mentioned this question of high resolution in some of your own research. I mean, I think you've opened up visions of future possibilities where you might be able to use in relatively recent prehistoric societies where people were burying a lot of their dead for archaeologists now to excavate, we could see the possibility of actually almost being able to reconstruct communities, perhaps not entire communities, and we often imagine, I think rightly, that only certain people were being buried and others weren't. But I mean, there's an instance on Salisbury Plain where we've got 3 burials separated by a few miles of individuals who genetics show to have been really quite closely related. And when we know, for example, that one person is somebody else's parent, we have a pretty precise chronological relationship between 2 individuals that no other science really could give us at the moment. And so there are possibilities in the future of really building up complex patterns of relationships that I think will hugely inform our archaeological understanding of communities and identities at the time, or at least inform our debate. And this is something that, Joe, you've been thinking a lot about. And one of the issues that has been raised already quite a few times is of ancient migrations. And in the past, in recent decades, archaeologists have really seriously played down the notion of great migrations around the world, and particularly across Europe, on the basis largely that the old-fashioned evidence was just too equivocal and didn't support these pictures. Now, they're very much being revived now with genetics. And I wonder, I'm interested in what you make of some of the claims that are being made, and sometimes they're cloaked in terms of military invasions and armies and violence, and what really can ancient genetics tell us about this sort of issue, ethnic identities and family relationships?
Yeah, so absolutely, there's been a huge amount of debate over the last few years on how to interpret the evidence for things like massive shifts in ancestry change. In my case, I'm looking at the Bronze Age in Britain. That's the period that I work on. And that research that Tom alluded to there a few minutes ago, a paper published back in 2018, which showed that you had this huge change in genetic ancestry at the start of the Bronze Age. And I suppose that what I'm interested in is how archaeologists interpret this. So initially, when this research originally came out, it was viewed as evidence for a complete and sudden population replacement. And of course, as it happens, that population replacement seems to have occurred around the same time that you have the appearance of a new type of pottery in Britain, beaker pottery, and new ways of burying the dead. And those, of course, as Tom mentioned earlier, were changes, new kind of social and material conditions that archaeologists back in the early part of the 20th century had interpreted as evidence for migration into Britain. And so with the new genetic evidence, then this interpretation has re-emerged, and it's been sensationalized, and we ended up with headlines in the media back in 2018 when the research originally came out, about warlike hordes invading Britain and massacring the natives and all this kind of stuff. So the problem there, obviously, is that what's happening is that ethnic identity and genetic ancestry is getting elided. It's getting treated as if it's the same thing, which obviously it's not. And we know from more recent research that genetics, the people using the same material culture, so beaker pots and beaker burial practices in different parts of Europe, for example, actually often had quite different genetic ancestries.
Okay, hang on. Beaker pots and beaker burials, what are beaker people? Are they an ethnic group?
Well, I suppose historically archaeologists have thought that kind of way, but I think, we really need to pick this apart. I think this is a very problematic assumption. And actually the archaeological evidence for this kind of massive migration accompanied by violent displacement of native British people, the preceding Neolithic population, actually doesn't fit the archaeological evidence for all sorts of reasons. There's very little evidence for violence during the period, for example. And although there are continental immigrants, and yes, the ones that we happen to have sampled were buried with beaker pottery, they actually seem to be very interested in and engaged with indigenous Neolithic practices like the construction of big monuments like Stonehenge. So you have, beaker burials around Stonehenge, for example. And then also when we look at the chronological evidence, this idea of a sudden, swift replacement, perhaps caused by a mass migration and violence, doesn't really seem to bear out. So chronological modeling that Tom's done, in fact, shows that this probably was a very protracted process that could actually have taken place over as long as many as 16 generations. So we're going to have to think about different mechanisms for genetic change. And also we have to remember these are not, and again, Tom mentioned this, these are not, people sweeping on horseback from the far reaches of Eastern Europe. They're the genetic signatures of the beaker burials that have been sampled in Britain are most similar to those from the lower Rhine kind of region. So we're probably looking at quite gradual, quite small scale movement of people over relatively short distances over a very long period of time. And, these are perhaps, near neighbors on the continent with whom people in Britain might well have had long-standing ongoing relationships over the preceding centuries, rather than being, sudden immigrants. And of course, the other problem is that there's this idea that the indigenous Neolithic population is somehow wiped out by these immigrants. But actually, we're not really picking up. It's possible that those indigenous Neolithic populations persisted much longer than we think, and we're just not picking them up genetically because they don't dispose their dead, or they don't dispose of their dead in a way that is amenable to us picking it up through ancient DNA analysis, because they probably did things like excarnation, which might have resulted in bodies disappearing completely, or cremation. Cremated remains at the moment can't be assessed using ancient DNA.
And of course,
yeah, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, if we do, which we do, I think we all agree that we have got copious evidence that people across the Channel were coming into Britain from continental Europe throughout much of prehistory, but at this particular time, around about 2000 BC. And if people are coming, say, from France, they're very likely to have their own origin myths, because that's what people do, that's what we all do. But there's no saying what those myths might have been. I mean, they might have referred to people coming from the distant east at some time in the distant past, but equally they could, I mean, it's conceivable, isn't it? I think that people could have had an origin myth that they came from Scotland or from the north of Britain and that they were returning to their homelands. I mean, do you think there's ever any way we could actually access that type of thinking about ancient identity?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a very good question, but certainly, people who are coming into Britain during this period are very interested in particular landscape features, in monuments of long-standing religious significance and cultural significance in Britain, like Stonehenge, but other natural landscape features as well. So it's entirely possible that they must have known about this in some kind of way, certainly. But again, the other thing I was going to just say, I suppose, I've talked about ethnic identity, but there's also the whole thing about gender identity. And just going back to that example that you mentioned earlier, when you're chatting to Tom about the relatives, the Amesbury, that group of 4, it is, isn't it, Tom? I think relatives who in the Amesbury area, we can show that there's the 2 brothers and their possible uncle and the daughter of one of them, this kind of thing. But I think, again, yes, we can see what the genetic relationships are, the biological relationships, but we don't know their social significance. We don't know what people made of those relationships. So those people are related through the paternal line. And archaeologists have this terrible propensity to kind of impose contemporary kinds of ideas about how society works onto the past. So Bronze Age archaeologists for years have assumed that Bronze Age societies were patriarchal and all this kind of thing. And as soon as we see paternal relationships, as soon as we identify paternal links in the genetic data, we're kind of assuming, oh, it's a patrilineal, patriarchal society. But actually, if you look at the archaeological evidence, there are women in the center of substantial Bronze Age burial monuments. There are women with exotic objects, buried with exotic objects. There are women whose bodies were clearly treated and curated as ancestral relics. So I think, you know, you can start to use the archaeological evidence to actually unpick some of these kinds of assumptions.
Well, there's an interesting point there. I mean, Adam, in modern society, we know from genetic research that very often people who are accepted by families to be brothers and sisters and so on sometimes turn out not to have the parents that genetically that the family says they do. I mean, this is quite common, isn't it?
Are you asking me that? Yes, you were.
Yeah.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I think that one of the things, you know, I'm very casual about being, well, critical, mean-spirited, perhaps, about ancestry testing kits. And Tom alluded to this. This whole thing is a sort of great agreement panel, which is jolly good fun. But the DNA is very, very good at establishing immediate relationships, right? And then, so what that means is, you know, we can identify if you share half of your DNA with your brother or your sister and half your DNA with your parents. And therefore, this whole era that we're going through with ancestry DNA commercial tests is actually very rich for establishing really exciting, powerful stories about lost cousins or adopted parents, or I mean, adopted people. You can't adopt a parent. That'd be super weird. And so in that sense has great power, but the relatedness that DNA can talk about, as Tom alluded to, just drops off a cliff after about third or fourth cousins, and it stops being informative in any sort of meaningful way. But that, again, doesn't really stop people, you know, making assumptions about the power of this bit of this molecular evidence for reinforcing stereotypes about narratives that we like to tell ourselves, how we fit into the big stories, how we, you know, can trace our ancestry back through 1,000 years in Britain or 1,000 years wherever, and actually where, you know, you carry none of the DNA of many of your ancestors. Our estimates are, the calculations are that if you go 11 generations back, you only carry DNA from half of those ancestors, just because of the mechanics of how meiosis works. So you're not genetically related to half of your ancestors just 11 generations back. And yet the narratives, the stories that we tell ourselves about the power of genetics and the power of DNA in putting ourselves into the grand sort of fundamental glittering sweep of history, you end up with a sort of hoary old story which doesn't mean anything at all. One of the things I think, yeah, when I was listening to Joe just then, I think one of the fundamental issues we have in this whole discussion, whether we're talking about Neanderthals, or we're talking about Cheddar Man, or the Beaker people, or race and eugenics, and all of these sort of slightly disparate fields which relate history to biology, the interface between what's inside ourselves and how we behave as societies, is that we just don't have the language to describe what has happened in the deep past in ways which are informative and don't rely on the narratives that we tell ourselves in the present. So, you know, Chris's work is dominated by a much older history than what Joe's talking about. And we talk about migratory patterns across, we talk about things like the out of Africa event, or the migration of a species out of Africa to populate the rest of the world. Well, you know, again, I think Joe said this a second ago, the rate at which these migrations are happening is, you know, much slower than moving from East Dulwich to West Dulwich over a 10-year period, which is what I've done, right? And yet we use the same language as we do for some people migrating from Syria to Europe today under refugee status. Right? And we draw maps. We draw these broad sweeping maps, which I always refer to as Dad's Army maps, because they got big arrows which go, we were here, and then there's a big arrow, and we ended up here. And we understand the sweep of history over geological time periods using them. I'm not saying they're not informative, but I think they sometimes point to stories which are very difficult for us to understand over multi-generational time spans or much longer time spans. And so when we casually say, yeah, there was almost complete population replacement of the people of the British Isles over a period of, what was it, 200 years, 300 years, whatever, right? well, I don't know what my ancestors were doing 200 years ago. And I've got 1,000 ancestors 200 years ago, because that's how family trees work. And even if I can identify 10 of them, that's 1% of my ancestors from I had to do some quick maths there.
And of course, you've got history as well to help you, which people around Stonehenge had nothing except oral memory.
Exactly. So I think that, Joe used the word ethnicity a couple of times then, which we sort of understand what it means, and but it means different things in different scientific fields. Words like ethnicity and ancestry, and then redundant words like race and not redundant words, but like populations. All of these words within different scientific disciplines have subtly different meanings. There are also words that people outside of science use and know and have subtly different meanings outside of science. And we sort of just pile them all in the middle and say, well, what are you talking about when you talk about race? What are you talking about when you mean ethnicity? Is it cultural? Is it biological? And the truth is that none of these terms, none of the language that we use has rigid definitions which accurately describe the difference between what we imagine is true based on our own experience, which is a very, very powerful narrative, and what the archaeological or genetic or whatever the rigorous scientific evidence is. And I think that disconnect is, well, I think it's one that we find hard to tackle, right? And I think all of us on this panel and a lot of people involved in not just doing primary research, but talking about primary research to broader publics, I don't think we've resolved it. I don't think we've resolved it between fields. I can talk to Tom or geneticists, population geneticists, my colleagues, and we can talk in a specific way. And then we talk to Joe or Chris, and the language is slightly different, and we have to listen very carefully. And then there's the whole thing that I was alluding to earlier, which is, then engaging with actual historians who've been doing this shit for thousands of years longer than we knew that DNA actually existed. So there's a humility that comes with that as well. But I don't know how to resolve this. But I think the semantics and the language is fundamentally problematic to how we talk about the past.
Okay, I think that's really, really good point. And I think the issue of the inadequacy of our language really brings me to Subhadra. Hello, Subhadra. And I think, we've got this ability to, or we think we do, to investigate genetic histories. And this has come along at a time when already identity, race and culture are really quite hot, complex topics. And of course, the field, as we all know, has a very dark past. So, Subhadra, do you think that ancient DNA might actually offer us an escape from some of the prejudice and ignorance, or does it bring its own new dangers?
Well, short answer, yes and no. Slightly longer answer. You're certainly right in saying that topics like race they're hot topics at the moment, but I feel the need to point out that resistance to white supremacy dates much further back than the events of May last year. So Black Lives Matter as a movement itself dates to 2013, not simply to last year. The civil rights movement dates to the 1950s, and there was certainly resistance to white supremacy in the United States in the forms of things that led to the civil rights movement for decades previously. And colonized people have resisted colonization since the beginnings of colonization, and some of them continue to do so in the Americas particularly, and in Australasia. So I think we need to remember that just because white people have noticed that race is a problem in Western society, there are those of us who have cottoned onto this slightly earlier. And I think you also make a very good point about this topic being in the dark. And part of that is that we tend not to shine a light on the very recent history of where these ideas come from. I'm a historian of race, I'm a historian of eugenics, and it's just astonishing to me, and I'm almost entirely self-taught in this as well, because these are not subjects that we learn in school. There are brilliant people around this table. Adam particularly really should be a lot more famous than he is. I think it's quite telling that he's not more famous than he is, because of the difficult topics he chooses to discuss. He could choose to talk about much safer things, but thanks for us, he chooses not to. And I think what a lot of us are butting up against is, again, it's a cross-disciplinary issue in terms of thinking about science and history. And what I think a lot of people in the sciences are learning about now, that historians knew, is that the history curriculum at school is pretty near useless. It doesn't really speak to kind of any of the important issues. And also the thing that we're butting up against is nationalism, because our ideas to do with our identities are really more closely formed in a very recent history and to do with nationalistic ideas. So, I mean, even the title here, someone earlier mentioned, you know, we're talking about British prehistory. Britain doesn't extend back to prehistory. You know, that's not a notion that anyone particularly, I'm aware of my Irish colleague across the thing smiling and laughing about that. Britain is a relatively recent idea in terms of a national idea. And what I feel is needed is, as Adam was talking about, a much clearer and wider conversation about what we mean by these terms, things like race. So when I talk about race, what I'm talking about is a historically constructed idea that comes out of the Enlightenment and feeds on notions of, we've talked about biological essentialism. I would argue that biological essentialism, so the idea, the way that someone looks can tell you more about them than simply the way that they look, is not necessarily a human instinct. It's a relatively recent historical construct that comes out of the Enlightenment. You've got people like Lavater who talk about they take medieval ideas to do with the humours and they start to crystallize those into what then becomes our conception scientifically, or in the history of science, of ideas like race. So we go from Lavater and this idea of physiognomy, the way that you look is the way that you are, into what become then more crystallized notions of races. You've got Carl Linnaeus talking about them when he starts to do his taxonomy. You've got other people that are called scientific racists, or people who do race science, like Blumenbach, like Vacher de la Puig. You know, they come up with multiple numbers of different kinds of races. Usually, you know, there's not any consistency among them. You know, some say that there's 3, some say there's 4, some say there's 5. The general consistency tends to be that white people are at the top and black people are at the bottom. These things are all spurious. There's no truth to any of them. We're not necessarily here to debate whether or not those things are correct. I think those debates have already been had. But it's really interesting how those ideas about superiority persist through time. This is what I was talking about when I first answered that question that you put. And what we need to think about more clearly is these intersections between our historical ideas, race. There's a lot of people around this table who do brilliant work who say there is no such thing as race. Biologically speaking, there is no genetic basis for understanding race. And that's really important to do. But what it clouds the issue is, if there's no such thing as race, why are we talking about it in the first place? Where did the idea come from? And while it's important to acknowledge that it was a social construct, it's also important to acknowledge that it was a social construct within the realms of science, within the realms of European science during the Enlightenment and then carrying on. And these then again start to trip up on our ideas of nationalism. So an example that I want to give you that's quite current, relatively a few months ago, we were in a lot of discussion about the nature of the British people. And we were told that we are a freedom-loving people, that we would not stand to wear masks or go into isolation or be locked down in our homes. It turned out to be completely the opposite. But those ideas about who the British people are in terms of how science and how we should be led by science in a global pandemic were particularly interesting. And to me, the thing that was very painful, it didn't last very long, thankfully, but for a couple of days, there was a discussion about Black and brown people dying in disproportionate numbers for COVID-19. And there was someone had raised the issue that, was there a genetic reason why this was happening? And as I said, I'm not a geneticist. I'm completely open to the idea that there might have been a genetic reason or a genetic predisposition amongst non-white populations to COVID-19. But I feel like the fact that we jumped to that before we started to consider who was working in the front lines of our hospitals, of our transport infrastructure, of our supermarkets, and keeping our society going, this is where these problems start to reiterate themselves. And in terms of the ways in which we all around this table are starting to think about things more meaningfully, is that for a long time, the history of eugenics, the history of race, and the history of genetics, which arises out of those two sciences, have focused on the things that make us different from each other. And I wonder what it would start to look like if we started to think less about the things that divide us and more about the things that unite us as humans.
I mean, do you think that if when you're in the area in which you work and where your thinking takes you, that the science of DNA can be helpful, or do you think it's a distraction?
I don't think that that's a useful binary. I think that there has been a huge amount of work done in genetic research toward the elimination of heritable diseases, for example. But sometimes what we need to do is to actually listen to the people who are affected by that. So another thing that has come out of the pandemic more recently is the hideous way in which disabled people are treated in our society. That they were ostensibly considered expendable. Or when they were asked to protect themselves, they were told to protect themselves with no infrastructures to be able to take care of themselves. I think that there is a huge potential for genetic research to be useful to individuals, to society more widely, but we're still stuck in these very particular ways of thinking. And until we start to break down those barriers and bust out of those ways of thinking, I think, historically, there have been examples of people, I'm trying to remember some famous eugenicists that other people have heard about. Alexander Graham Bell is probably the best example, known for his invention of the telephone, but was hugely interested in the heritability of deafness. The deaf community vilify him entirely because the research that he did and the work that he was trying to propound was to eradicate deafness. And as far as deaf people are concerned, they are humans too. They are a community in and of themselves. They don't deserve to be exterminated. So yeah, I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic and I'm a rationalist. I believe in the power of science to make things better for us. I just don't think we're in a place where we need to do a lot more work before you're going to convince me that it's safe to do that yet.
We need to understand the science, but we need to also embed it within society, don't we? We need to put people first.
People first, absolutely. And I'm actually I thought Adam was really generous about scientists needing to be better historians. 100% agree with that. But I also agree that the rest of us should probably be better scientists. There's no excuse, is there?
Okay, thank you all. My head's buzzing already. I think it's time to move on to questions from people outside the panel and myself. I've got a lot of questions here. We've got some really, really interesting questions. I'm going to take one that takes us right back to the beginning in a way. And I think what's interesting about this particular question that comes from David Truman, I'll read out his question. It says he hopes he's not preempting anyone. He asked it quite early, I think. How useful is DNA in tracking hominid migration? And what I thought was interesting about this question was that particular word hominid, because if you take it literally, that embraces the great apes as well as early humans. And I think in the field of human evolution, we're learning increasingly how complicated the human family tree, if you like, was, and how many different species and subspecies there are likely to have been, and there's a great deal of crossbreeding and movement and so on. But we're learning relatively little about the great apes, and in the early millions of years of human evolution, the distinction between one, I think, human species and another ape species is not necessarily as strong as it was now. And I wonder, perhaps Chris Stringer, DNA tracking migration of early humans and great apes, I mean, is there a future there? Chris, we can't hear you. You're muted.
The host is unmuting me, thank you.
Hi.
Yeah, so, well, of course, we don't have ancient DNA from the very early stages of human evolution, and that's very sad, and we may never have that. We may have proteins to come from some of these fossils, but obviously, before there was ancient DNA, there were the ape, the apes represented by genetic material, and us, and nothing in between. Now, at least, we can add Neanderthals and Denisovans in terms of genomes, but they're still very close to us. So all of those earlier forms genetics, I don't think can really help us. I mean, there obviously were some significant genetic events. So, for example, we had a fusion event in our history, and whether Tom or Adam can talk about it, where two of our chromosomes fused together compared with the chromosomes in gorillas and chimpanzees. Some people think that was a very significant event, and they dated around 2 million years ago. So that might tell you something about something, but I think we can't pin that down accurately. I don't know whether Adam or Tom will talk about that in a minute. So in terms of migrations and dispersions, I don't think the DNA can really help us until we get to the recent past. And then, yes, the DNA can start to help track movements of modern humans out of Africa. So if you saw The Observer on Sunday, there was a piece about the early arrival of modern humans in Europe based on DNA evidence. And what we're finding there is that there were earlier dispersals than we thought, a few thousand years earlier at least. And genetically, those individuals seem to have given virtually no DNA to later populations in Europe. So we had these early dispersals, and people call them failed dispersals, but obviously, some of them got quite some distance and they persisted for a while, but they didn't persist apparently alongside the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals actually came back into those regions, and those populations disappear. So we can track those little bits of migrations, and we can date the main movement of modern humans out of Africa is dated at around 60,000 years ago. But there is evidence that there must have been some significant earlier dispersals. So there's a site in Australia, Northern Australia, called Madjabebi 2, and that's dated at 65,000 years by what seems to me to be quite sound evidence. Complex human behaviour in Northern Australia 65,000 years ago. Now, according to the main genetic data, modern humans, the main dispersal, had not left Africa. So clearly, if that data from Australia is correct, there was an earlier dispersal, which we can't track by any DNA evidence at the moment. So I think, we don't have the capability of really mapping dispersions. And as for the primates, well, yes, we can look at the modern distributions of gorillas and chimpanzees, orangutans and gibbons. We know they had wider distributions in the past, many of them, and different distributions. The orang was much more widespread over Southeast Asia in the past than it is today. But again, that's not based on DNA data, it's based on fossil evidence, really. So, so I don't think we can really say much. I don't know whether anyone else would like to come in on that.
I definitely could, and I concede to Tom if he wants to add to that. I mean, I think that what Chris says is absolutely correct. I think there are the significant things that we can say with some confidence, such as what we was alluding to there was that we have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, whereas the rest of the great apes, of which we are one, have 48. And there's clear genetic evidence that our chromosome 2 is the fusion of two chromosomes from an ancestor which persisted, which didn't happen in the lineage, which resulted in chimpanzees and gorillas. So there is an event there. There is a sort of a hub in evolution where things flowed into one point, a thing happened, and as a result, other things happened further down the line. The nebulousness with which I said that is deliberate. That's not just me fudging what we know about this. I think we attribute far too much definitive answers, far too much certainty on things that we can measure, especially when it comes to DNA. And it all goes back to what we've been talking about for the last hour or so, which is, how confident can we be in using DNA as a piece of historical evidence? The migrations out of Africa, Chris is the global expert on this, and it's far be it for me to even contribute to what he just said there. But it's absolutely true that we know that there were migrations, or there were Homo sapiens outside of Africa way earlier than the main migration for which we have very, very strong evidence for. And that includes not just the ones he was talking about there, but the distance that we are now beginning to find fossils in Asia and into Australasia, and but also in Greece. A couple of years ago, Homo sapiens skulls and Neanderthal skulls found embedded in cave walls in Apodema in Greece, and they predate the out of Africa event of 60 to 80,000 years ago by, what is it, Chris? Like, I mean, 200,000 years.
Over 100,000 years anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, I think, you know, I flip between the loving the fine details of the science as it's presented in academic papers, which deal with very, very, you know, precise areas of evidence and you know, particular bits of DNA or bits of fossil evidence, bits of cultural evidence, and then the broader sweep of things. That's sort of where I exist in my professional career, and often it's hard to rectify those things, right? You know, how do we talk about the fact that we are an African species, which means that most of our evolution occurred within Africa, and the biggest pool of genetic diversity is within Africa, or people of recent African origins. We've got great genetic evidence for that. We've got great fossil evidence for that. And then how do we tell the story of 500,000 years worth of human evolution that has occurred in locations that, I mean, even the use of the word Africa is fundamentally problematic in this. This is a continent that has, well, today, what is it? I can't remember the number, 2 billion people on it, 54 countries. And we very casually say, you know, we're from Africa, the out of Africa hypothesis. The work by people like Chris and others is beginning to show that we're a sort of, we're now beginning to think of ourselves as a sort of Pan-African species, a Gestalt species that has emerged from multiple locations in and around Africa. And it's hard to tell a simple narrative about that and square it with the evidence, which is what's emerging from both fossils and DNA and also cultural evidence. So I think one of the fundamental problems with this is that we like stories. Humans like narrative satisfaction. We like beginnings, middles, and ends, and we like a story which tells us something very specific, not just about the grand sweep of human history, but about our place in this. And evolution and science are not willing to do that. And that's the circle that we have to square when doing our science and talking about it. How do we get from the stories we want to tell to what the evidence actually says?
I think one of the inevitably developed stories in particular concerns Neanderthals, and we got a lot of questions about Neanderthals, and there's one I'd like to pick up. It comes from Nigel Sadler, and he's asking specifically about what he calls sexual encounters. In other words, how do these two species that we now know were physically interacting and breeding? I've lost this question. And he's wondering, actually, you know, we know that from the genetics, but he's wondering from a kind of behavioral point of view, how might this have worked? And this chimed me because I remember a few decades ago, somebody came up with this theory to explain the extinction of Neanderthals. And at the time, I remember that the average, from the fossil evidence, the average head size, the average brain size for Neanderthals was actually slightly larger than Homo sapiens. And this guy had this idea that could explain the extinction of Neanderthals entirely in those terms, and that the babies of Neanderthals had such big heads that they became a major danger, that birth was so dangerous that the species eventually became extinct. I'm not sure that's
birth in modern humans being such a safe enterprise. We should remind them, I feel, right? Because we've got it nailed now. We're fine.
But I think that there is an interesting issue, isn't there? That you know, you've got on the face of it. I mean, the archaeology and the fossil evidence does seem to paint a picture of Neanderthals and early modern humans as really looking quite different and behaving quite differently. And actually, how do we imagine these kind of incidents of sexual congress came about? I mean, is this because we don't see this among great apes, or is it simply because there isn't the variety of species and subspecies today on the planet where we could actually see this operating?
Yes. I mean, I'll start with it and others can join in. So I mean, obviously, first of all, on the behavioural side, most of the evidence goes now suggests Neanderthals are much closer to us in behaviour than I would have said certainly 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. So Neanderthals behaviourally are much more like us, culturally much more like us. We may have diverged more after they disappeared. Obviously, we moved on and there were many extra changes. But if we look at the period 40 to 50,000 years ago, the groups were, there wasn't much difference between them in behaviour. Brain size, as you mentioned, Neanderthals were large-brained. They were complex people. I'm sure they had some kind of language. So these things, which some people in the past used as reasons that we swept in and just wiped them out because of our great superiority, I don't think, there are very few people who would argue that now. And instead, we came into these territories and there was interbreeding. And how it happened, well, I mean, the short answer is we don't know, of course, how it happened. There are many different ideas, and they go from peaceful encounters, exchanging partners, through to kidnapping female Neanderthals from their groups. Bands of men run out of females. This happens sometimes in chimpanzees. Apparently claimed to happen in hunter-gatherer groups. Sometimes a group will steal females from another group. Maybe that's what happened in some cases. So there's a whole range of behaviours. It could include adopting orphan Neanderthal babies into the group, ones that have been orphaned or abandoned or found and brought into the group and adopted. All of those could have happened. I think genetically, and Tom and Adam could talk about this more, I believe that it may be possible one day to tell whether the Neanderthal DNA mainly came in through males or females or equally, and that might help us determine a little bit more about how the matings happened. But these individuals were brought up in modern human societies, or their DNA wouldn't have continued in the way it did. And one interesting thing is that at the moment there is an asymmetry in that we can see Neanderthal DNA coming into the modern humans between 40 and 50,000 years ago, but the known Neanderthals from that period don't show an equivalent appearance of modern human DNA. So there is the possibility that the DNA was mainly going one way into modern humans, or there is another possibility that it was going the other way, but for some reason there was more of a fertility barrier in the interbreeding in the other direction. And again, Tom or Adam might know more about hybrids in other mammals, where apparently this can happen, that there's asymmetric spreading of the DNA when two closely related species interbreed. The hybrids between the two may be different in fertility, and the males and females, the daughters and sons of that are hybrids, will also be different. So in some cases, males in hybrids are much less successful, much less fertile, going on for further interbreeding. So all those are models we can apply, but the short answer is we don't know how it happened, but it happened certainly more often than I would have said a few years ago. There was a major event maybe more than 50,000 years ago, and then there were add-ons of local additional interbreeding events, even down to 40 or 41,000 years ago, close to the time that Neanderthals physically disappeared. But of course, genetically, they didn't disappear. And in the Observer on Sunday, I suggested in that article that this interbreeding might have even been a factor in Neanderthal disappearance. If modern humans were larger in number, but were exchanging partners with Neanderthals, Neanderthal partners were going into modern human groups, and then they're lost from their parent groups. So Neanderthals, in a sense, might have been absorbed out of existence. If they had smaller population numbers, if they're losing prime age individuals into modern human groups for interbreeding, then those individuals are lost from the Neanderthal gene pool, and the Neanderthal population just fades away. So, yeah, these are all interesting possibilities, and we really don't know the mechanisms at the moment.
So if we've got so many people today with little bits of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, I mean, is there the possibility that one day you could actually bring all these bits together and ultimately reconstruct a complete Neanderthal genome from modern DNA? And if we could do that, where would it help us in any way?
I'm not. I think Adam or Tom could have a go at that one.
Yeah, well, I'll do it briefly because the answer is no. The answer is no for complex reasons, but simple reasons as well. We although we have multiple complete Neanderthal genomes now, there's many qualifications to what that actually means. And Tom, I'm definitely going to pass across to Tom, because in terms of, like, you know, when we talk about a complete genome, or we can talk about a sequence, what does that actually mean in terms of the practicalities of what A's and C's and T's and G's we've actually got, right? Chris alluded to earlier, and we talked a little bit about the fusion of 2 chromosomes to produce chromosome 2, which appears to be a significant event in the genesis of Homo sapiens genotype. Now, we think we know roughly when that happened, and we think we know because we can draw cladistic maps, sort of branching trees about when we think that happened. But even though, I believe I'm right in saying this, and please do correct me if this is not correct, but with all of our complete sequences of Neanderthal genomes and Denisovans and phantom species that we don't know really what they were, but we've got DNA evidence for them, ancient DNA is very good at particular things. If you've got good sequence, if you've got lots of coverage, and therefore you're confident in what the actual letters are, what they actually code for, the genes that are involved. But our genomes don't just consist of genes, and they don't just consist of bits which regulate genes. There's huge, I mean, the majority of the human genome is actually stuff that is not genes, and not even regulatory portions that turn genes on and off at the right time while we're developing and growing and so on. There's all sorts of bits of molecular scaffolding that are just to do with the way that mitosis and meiosis actually occurs. And, you know, when people think about chromosomes, they always draw them in those little sort of twisted sock patterns where they're X's, and can't do it. Come on, I just look like I'm swearing when I'm doing that. But, you know, they have little knots in the middle, and they have telomeres at the end, and all sorts of bits of structure that help biology, that allow biology to take place when a cell divides, or a sperm or egg is made. And those bits of DNA are not well preserved, right? And we don't, I think I'm right in saying that even though we know that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, including the X and X, or X and Y if you're biologically male or female, I don't think we know that for Neanderthals or Denisovans. I think it's highly likely that they were also 23 pairs of chromosomes, 46 in total. But I don't think we actually know that, and have ever been able to demonstrate that. And I'm definitely deferring to Tom on this, using the genetic evidence that is available to us from scraping it out of the humerus of GB1 or other Neanderthal old bones. Is that right, Tom? Am I right in saying that?
Well, I mean, to begin with, going back to the sexual congress question, I mean, these groups were interacting, you know, when we talk about like these ideas about migration, and in relative terms, they weren't interacting for too long, but we're still talking about thousands of years. I think essentially, if you can imagine it, it was probably happening. So I think you can go crazy on that question if you want to, in terms of what you can imagine happening. So this it can be a bit misleading sometimes when ancient DNA and geneticists talk about whole genomes or genome-wide information, in that this does not mean that we have every single part of the genetic sequence of an ancient individual, or can confidently sort of say what a particular position was in a particular part of the genome, but we don't need to a lot of the time to look at genetic association. So I think I'm right in saying that we only really got the full human genome, as in every single letter position characterized in the last couple of years or something.
July.
So was it that recent?
Yeah, it was July this year. The first human genome
this year
was published in 2000, February 2001. The complete sequence was published in July this year. The number of times the human genome sequence has been finished is just a lot.
So there's a gap here. So clearly we don't have a whole Neanderthal genome. People will talk about Neanderthal whole genomes, which isn't the same as having the entire genome, but it's enough to be able to say certain things. So maybe I've heard people talk about seeing whether different people in different parts of the world have different parts of a Neanderthal genome, and trying to reconstruct it from that as being a possibility. Whether it's practically possible, I'm not so certain. But yeah, from ancient DNA, a lot of it's got to do with preservation, and in some cases because in terms of how well you can reconstruct a whole genome, and how far you would be able to sometimes just the bits of the genome that you want just aren't there, they just haven't preserved. So you'll potentially never get that part of the genome. So yeah, potentially the entire genome of Neanderthal might be something that we might never be able to get, although that doesn't matter for a lot of the questions that we're interested in asking about them.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
just very briefly to follow on from that, because I think this is important, right? Because we're quite casual about talking about whole genomes and genetics and ancient DNA and knowing our own evolutionary history as a result of being able to get DNA out of old bones. We don't fundamentally understand human genetics in living people. We've got a really good model of how it works, but there are huge chunks of the human genome that we simply don't understand, don't have access to. There are so much of the human genome, the human genome of extant people, of us today, is just repeat sequences, either tiny bits of repeats that repeat thousands or hundreds of thousands of times, longer bits that repeat, and sometimes they're important, sometimes they're not, and we can't really tell. There, you know, people used to talk about junk DNA, and there's definitely bits of DNA which are appear to be, you know, genetic fossils of stuff that happened in our evolutionary past and has no real purpose today. But there's also tons and tons of bits that we simply don't understand to this day. Just looking in the chat right now, Debbie Kennett, who is a genetic genealogist, also at UCL, and knows more about ancestry and genetics than anyone on earth, just pointed out that there's huge chunks of the Y chromosome that we just can't read, right? It's just really hard to understand what is on one of the most, well, part of the genome that has been well studied over the last 20 how many years, right? So there's huge, we got so many gaps in our knowledge of just the fundamentals of how DNA actually works, that when people talk about, you know, we've got a genome, we've got the full genome for the Neanderthals or mammoths, and then people say, well, what we're going to do now is we're going to set up a company. I'm talking about George Church or others. What we're going to do now is we're going to resurrect the mammoth, or we're going to find women who are willing to engage in some kind of science fiction practice, which means that the child that she will bear will be Neanderthal. We're just in a fantasy world of which bears no relation to how we understand genetics to this day. The idea that we could bring back the mammoths from, even though we have complete mammoth genome sequences, that we could somehow clone mammoths based on the DNA of their genomes that we've retrieved from their carcasses, or they're not fossils but ancient remains. It's as far as I'm concerned, is not only like a complete scientific fiction, it's also completely so far from any sort of ethical or moral questions that also emerge from that. I just get amazed that we're even having this conversation. It just seems nuts to me.
Well, look, ethics is really big in this field, and here I'd like to bring in Subhadra. We've got a really interesting question from Cole Mukherjee, who about the ethics of evolutionary science and genetic research and their relationships with indigenous communities, and Cole's wondering what the future looks like in terms of dismantling the exploitative research frameworks, and not least with reference to modern use of indigenous people's DNA. Subhadra?
Wow, that is a really good question.
It's a big question.
Just thank you to Cole for engaging at that level. Okay, so that is interesting. And I think my ignorance is going to show a little bit here in terms of DNA from indigenous peoples. My understanding is that there might be kind of like there's almost like a racism in reverse scenario happening here, by which I don't mean reverse racism. That isn't a thing that exists. What I mean is that indigenous communities, and actually non-white populations in general, and I'm aware that term is problematic, tend not to be as well represented in DNA databases, certainly commercial DNA databases. And the there is an aspect there of the lack of information there potentially being a lens to potentially marginally less exploitation than would be the case otherwise. I think this might also be more of a universalizing aspect than we think it is, because of the nature of how we give our DNA information away so easily, that the thought of any kind of security or sort of post hoc ideas to do with ethics and what happens with DNA, regardless of the actual scientific possibility of it, there's almost no point in having that conversation anymore, because all that information is already out there. There is a great amount of discourse in terms of the legal use of DNA, so things like forensic genealogy and those sorts of things. In terms of redressing the balance to Indigenous communities, yeah, I can't even imagine what that looks like, actually. That, again, is something that, is hopefully not so far in the future, because I think it's an important thing. But yeah, to conceptualize it, I'm stumped.
Jo
might have something to say.
No, I was just going to come in there and say that there's been a lot of discussion amongst Indigenous theorists of exactly this kind of thing. And I think that one of the issues with genetics is that it speaks about a particular kind of relatedness, and a kind of relatedness that's prioritized within colonial and imperial discourses historically. So it's very heteronormative. It's based on sexual relationships. It's very much part and parcel of a way of thinking about gender, about family structures that was critical to colonialism and colonial expansion. It's what various scholars have termed this idea of settler sexuality, that monogamous, heteronormative, patriarchal kind of family structures, they facilitate colonialism in that they facilitate the transmission of land in a particular way. They make women and land and animals and Indigenous peoples into, objects that can be exchanged and brought into transactions. So I think the fact that genetics focuses on and prioritizing the sorts of sexual relationships, or the sorts of relationships that are part of that narrative and that ideology, is in itself potentially quite problematic, certainly for archaeologists. Then we forget to think about other forms of relationships. And Indigenous scholars have been writing about other types of kinship beyond human kinship with animals, kinship with the land. We get into obviously ongoing discussions around environmental issues and sustainability and so on. We see the land as other, as different, as non-kin, and it's all part of this kind of colonial legacy. I think we have to be very careful about how we assume that the sorts of relationships that are discussed in the genetic data or uncovered in genetic data, that we somehow assume these would have that they have priority and they have supremacy. Going back to this whole thing of biological essentialism again, I think it's quite problematic. We need to. It's a question that we need to think about.
So would you say then that while the genetic data offers all sorts of new insights into relationships, at the end of the day, it is still our philosophical approach to the past and to human society that ultimately decides how we read these data rather than the science? It's
a paradigm. Yeah, that's potentially a little bit too specialist a term, but yeah, the frames in which we have it's both a paradigm and an ideology, if we're going to go really into the hardcore theory of it, which is a set of ideas that is used as a basis for imposing power. Joe, that was such a brilliant answer. Mike, you really asked the wrong person to answer that previous question. And I just want to share with the group, Debbie Kennett is working very hard on our behalf and has shared that in the United States, there are Indigenous geneticists who have set up their own native biodata consortium so they can have control over their own data. So that is what that potentially looks like.
Yeah, as I don't work with Indigenous remains from places like America and Africa and Australia, I'm not obviously an authority on this. But I mean, the ideal situation is that, I mean, mainly because of the abuses that there's been of genetic data, particularly of groups in North America, but in other places as well, use of data without permission and without thinking about what benefit it has to the communities who provided the data. I think that there has to be a reckoning whereby scientists have to regain the trust of those a lot of those communities, and they have to do that by giving up control over some level of control to establish trust again. And it varies depending on which kind of indigenous communities we're talking about in different parts of the world. Obviously, different groups in different parts of the world have different views on this idea. And obviously, if you're working on human remains from Britain, you're not going to be talking about dealing with indigenous Britons, contemporary indigenous Britons, because that's a nonsense. So this isn't sort of globally applicable thing. But you know, an ideal situation was would these places, you know, would be able to set up their own laboratories and do their own work on the remains in sort of their own countries and totally control their data. You know, there were some calls that there should be a total moratorium on anyone working on human remains in these countries until that's possible. But then you're sort of faced with this sort of alternate aspect where, you know, realistically, if that happens for the next few decades until the infrastructures in these countries are built up to some extent, all we're going to get is data from Europe. And you know, there's a counter argument there that if Europe is, you know, totally you know, there's already sort of a sort of bias with respect to colonialism in our data in being so Eurocentric, and that's detrimental to other parts of the world. So it's a tricky situation. I mean, there's calls for, you know, big labs to try and finance labs in other countries as well. But, you know, I mean, people could easily sort of pitch that as being another form of colonialism by, you know, these big you know, labs from former colonies sort of funding their own labs there. So it's a difficult thing. Definitely there needs to be more a movement towards more self-determination of what's done with their data and the narratives that emerge from it, for sure. And it's a tricky question, and obviously it has different applications in different parts of the world.
Yes, Tom's exactly right. That I think just briefly to reiterate that point, there has been one of the things that's happened in the last 10 years as ancient DNA has become part of the mainstream, and our ability to extract DNA from old bones and understand DNA from extant people as well has grown in sophistication. Is there has effectively been a land grab, right? And there has been a land grab by the best scientists working in these fields who have raced to get hold of as many samples as possible in order to tell the richest stories about how, you know, why we're here, who is who, and what our ancestries are. And I do think there is a genuine recapitulation of colonialist history and the appalling relationship between Western scientists and indigenous populations, which is well documented, and the work that people like Subhadra have contributed to so brilliantly over the years. And I think we're only just recognizing that because we get very excited. But the whole ecosystem of science is designed to promote those very grand narratives, which are super exciting to tell. Those stories are very exciting. If we can say where these people came from, we can say where the peopling of America, how that happened, right? And completely disregard the fact that the peopling of America, the part of the narrative of the peopling of America includes, well, 20,000 years of indigenous people migrating across a large continent, for which we have archaeological and now genetic evidence, but also the invasion of colonists in the 15th century and onwards, and the persecution and genocide of all of those people in the Americas that were there before Europeans turned up in 1492. And I'm not saying that the people involved in understanding the genetics of, for example, in the peopling of America or wherever you are on Earth, are behaving in the same way that Columbus and other invaders and colonizers did. But the behavior of scientists in trying to get the most exciting stories and publish in the biggest journals in Nature and Science in order to tell these stories in the most dramatic ways because it's exciting has absolutely recapitulated the behavior of the past. And it's appalling, right? It's just appalling. What Tom was talking about there was exactly right. It is an antithetical to science and science communication to dip into communities as people who are power brokers or are the most powerful, who have hegemonic power, to go in and say, give us your DNA and we'll tell you where you came from. Because that is what has happened in the telling the story of the peopling of the Americas and elsewhere around the world in a way which is naive, clumsy, ham-fisted in my most generous version of telling this version of events, and is colonialistic and appalling and exploitative in the worst tellings of these stories. But that's the culture of science, right? The whole culture is publish in the most dramatic way, publish in the biggest journals, engage in it. It's a race. You've got to beat the next guy, and it always is guys. In order to get the best story out there, to get the next round of funding, to be at the best institute, to be at UCL or the Crick or the Natural History Museum or TCD or wherever we are, right? That's the culture that we operate in.
I'm not in TCD.
Yeah,
I'm sure you're right.
These sort of stories work well with the media, don't they? And of course, the journals are helping to put them out there. And Ellie Chambers noticed, Joe, that you mentioned media sensationalism earlier in this session, and she wonders whether or how we might communicate these sort of conversations to the public to help mitigate against these misunderstandings and modern notions of race and ethnicity that are presented in the press.
Well, I think Adam has actually captured that perfectly already, in the sense that we probably shouldn't be trying to publish in Nature, because it's those kind of headlines. It's those headlines that those big high status science journals require for you to be able to publish in them. And they're so short. The articles are so short. You can't get into the nuances. You can't get into the subtleties and the uncertainties and the provisos and all this kind of stuff that you could get into in a longer paper, a book even. So it is really difficult. And I think that as academics, we have to try and to point out the problems around this mode of publication, this way of funding, and fast science in general. We need to be doing slow science and thinking about these things and engaging with the local, the indigenous groups, for example, if that's who we're working with, or the public or whoever it is, to really talk through the sorts of issues that are real world issues in the present, and that we need to be understanding and exploring the complexities of that with not just within academia but beyond it. But it's a problem. And archaeologists actually, certainly, I can only speak for my own discipline, maybe geneticists are different, but archaeologists I think are really bad at talking to the public. We're just not very effective at actually expressing the challenges and complexities of our data. We like to generate these really clear, very sexy narratives that are get us the next bit of funding or whatever it might be, and we forget that our audiences are intelligent people, and we can explain to them how difficult it is, how nuanced these data sets are, and how they can actually be interpreted in multiple different ways. And we have to unpick our own assumptions, try and understand where we're coming from in order to be able to think about, well, maybe there are alternative ways of looking at all this data.
I think one of the difficulties with explaining archaeology is something it has in common with genetics, I think, to a wider public, is that in both cases, public understanding of the processes and the science is really, really not very good. And so you have to spend a lot of time explaining basic concepts, and you can get bogged down in that very easily and lose the interest of people who started off being interested, who then drift away and find something that is more immediately attractive and run with those stories. I think I've got a couple of questions about sedimentary DNA, which I think is interesting, quite different ones. But one, Christopher Hayden wonders whether it could ever be recovered from Neolithic pits in Britain. And another one, somebody is wondering, I've lost them, but they were here earlier, who wondered whether there might be DNA preserved in paint in Paleolithic cave art. And if that were the case, whether it might be possible to identify the species of the artist, or I suppose one could also say the gender of the artist, which would be interesting. I mean, anybody there?
So yeah, I mean, and quickly on the saliva point, there is already the saliva used to create the cave paintings. One of the Mesolithic people from, I think, present day Sweden, we have a genome of, was actually from a bit of bark that they chewed on, and they got like a whole genome from that, and that presumably came from the saliva. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Sedimentary DNA, potentially. You could look at more recent times. The problem is that at the moment, the type of information that you get out is very low resolution. So distinguishing between sort of Neanderthals and humans is pretty easy because you only need a bit of DNA to be able to distinguish between them. But sort of distinguishing between different modern human groups might be more difficult. But it's a possibility. The question you've got to ask yourself is it likely the DNA in those contexts is secure? It's not trickled in from somewhere else. You know, we're getting enough intrusive things in archaeological sediments that aren't DNA, which can cause problems. So, and there's no way of knowing whether the DNA you have is intrusive or not, unless you're absolutely sure that it was a sealed sediment. And a lot of these cave examples of caves where you have sedimentary DNA, sort of this suggestions is the fact that you get Neanderthal in DNA in there suggests that there's to some extent sealed sediments, but that's going to be the difficulty is distinguishing whether your bit of DNA has trickled down from somewhere else or is genuinely from that particular time spot.
Mm-hmm. Which is an issue in archaeology as a whole, isn't it? It's a problem. We're getting towards the end of our time. Is there anything anybody in the panel would like to say, to add to the conversation, something we might not have covered?
Well, I asked a question which you may not have seen, Mike, about whether we're ever going to get to Cheddar Man and whether we want to get to Cheddar Man. I thought it might come up with the question about me. Got
Cheddar Man, Chris.
I thought it might come up because of the hype, the media hype might lead to it. But I think, look, Tom's here, so really, I guess if there is anything to say more on Cheddar Man. Did we have any questions about Cheddar Man, Mike? I haven't seen all the questions.
I haven't seen one. No, to my surprise.
Well, maybe we've covered other important topics then, and we didn't need to cover Cheddar Man. But do you want to ask a question, Mike?
In some respects, it might be better to get Subhadra's perspective, because I mean, I think she gave her perspective on it, I think at the time on Channel 4, I remember seeing her. So in a way, I don't know, I can talk about it, but it might be more interesting to get her perspective first as far as she understands it, if she was willing to.
I'm always willing to talk and always willing to speak to the sensationalist media about these sorts of issues. I think the main point, given that we're low on time, is that the point that I made was that the science isn't necessarily going to stop the racists from being racists. You know, the fact that these arguments have come from a particular point in history, or that people have particular perceptions of what ancient Britons look like. Let's think about where those ideas came from and how those were constructed. Why, for such a long time, did we assume that Cheddar Man was white when it turned out that he was dark-skinned? I think is probably the best way to phrase that. So yeah, it's just a question of, where did these ideas come from? But also, I think there's so much more power and potentially so much more inclusivity we can do when actually we see what the real picture is, and we leave aside all of these hideous stereotypes. But Tom, was that the thing that you were thinking I was going to say?
Yeah. I mean, I think it speaks a lot about what you were talking earlier about so many ideas around genetics, particularly amongst the public, being embedded in these sort of racist colonialist pasts. And there's these ideas amongst the public that, you know, they don't consider themselves to be particularly offensive or aggressive or malignant, but they're there about ancestry and persistence in a particular area and supremacy in a particular area. And the problem is that when we try and communicate genetics work and sometimes archaeological work, it all just gets folded into those same narratives again, over and over again. And how to actually get it across in a genuinely subversive way, which is often what this stuff is doing, is really difficult. And it was interesting about Cheddar Man because that was something that was difficult, that really did sort of clash with cozy narratives about what maybe wasn't talked about so much, which maybe should have been, was the fact that there's this upset, that the fact that the Cheddar Man genetically was very dissimilar to not just in his skin pigmentation, but genetics generally, to people who live in who have ancestry from Britain, more recent ancestry from Britain today, sort of smashes these cozy narratives of people being in Britain for sort of time immemorial, and the kind of things that, exactly the kind of narratives that were utilised by people like Nick Griffin when he was on Question Time too. And it's really hard to do it in a way, and similarly you see in the way that the genetics evidence is used in service of ideas about invasion and sort of supremacy between different groups. It still sort of ends up feeding into these same ideas. So it's a question of how to wield it in a way that is, or whether it can be wielded in a way that doesn't produce these things, or actually sort of disrupts people, these cozy ideas, and allows people to reconsider their ideas of belonging and nationhood and things. And when it comes to narratives, the idea that we in Britain today are the end of the story is always a weird thing. It creates this really narcissistic version of people's history, where people are seeing history as leading up to them. It is nationalism in the sense that all nationalism is to that extent narcissistic. People are trying to create stories for themselves, often most of the time on a very individual level. And it's easy to see how the genetics could disrupt this, but it very rarely does, because it just gets squeezed into these same comforting narratives.
Can I just say, for anybody watching who actually doesn't know who Cheddar Man was, that is an interesting complete skeleton, unusual, around about 10,000 years old or so, from Somerset, and was the subject of a very early, as it were, a pre-genomic genetic study, which claimed to establish that there were people living in the village in Somerset who were directly descended from this individual, which is obviously now we can say is complete nonsense. And a more recent study, amongst other things, revealed that this person, as Subhadra said, had dark skin and dark hair, and indeed that this is part of a picture across Europe at that time. And it just reminds us that our genetic history and our cultural history, our ethnic diversity, and everything that involves is hugely complex, and already is being revealed to be much more complex than we'd ever imagined. And I think it's easy to think that this is how the future is going to go, is that things will become increasingly ever more complex. And in that sense, ancient DNA, modern DNA studies are hugely welcome, in that they're recognizing the complexity and diversity of modern humanity and of human history, which is what makes everything so wonderful and fascinating. Thank you, everybody. That was big, they were terrific. I'm really grateful to you and everything you contributed to this discussion. We could go on for hours, but I think we have to draw this to a close. I was going to ask you a question. I'm not sure we've got time for that, but thank you again. And I look forward to continuing these discussions elsewhere.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Hello, I'm just adding Clive back in, and Matt and Claire, so they can kind of sum up for us. Thank you, everyone. That was brilliant.
Really good. Thank you, everyone. It's been a fantastic evening.
I'll hand over to Clive.
Well, I'd just like to thank everyone. I thought that was a tremendous discussion. I've learned a huge amount. What came out time and time again for me was we've got, you know, for an archaeologist like myself, we're at that moment, which reminds me of, you know, the first radiocarbon dates. We're at another revolution, one where we could actually date the past. Now we can actually look at the people from the genetic context, and that's just really exciting. But I think so many of the panelists, all the panelists tonight have spoken really eloquently about how we've got this huge suitcase of history that we've got to unpack in order to be able to understand how to use these new techniques, and how importantly to get the various branches of deep history, the archaeology, the genetics, the paleontology, the environmental side, all those things, how we can then bring them together. And to some extent, it's not just a case of the geneticists becoming better historians, but I think we've all got to become better historians of science, which I think Subhadra is showing us the way in that particular aspect. So it's just been a great discussion. It also shows just how relevant deep history and archaeogenetics is to the study of contemporary issues which do fire people up and which do need resolution. So thank you so much to all our panelists for giving us the time here and the expertise. It's been really great, and a particular big thank you to Mike for chairing us and leading everyone through this. And from the Prehistoric Society, who are one of the joint organisers, I'd just like to thank all our colleagues from Queen Mary University, London, and from the Being Human event. And in particular, the names I'd like to mention are Claire Harris, Matt Knight, Simon Lewis, and in particular, again, Tess Mackling for pulling all those levers behind the scenes and making it all run so smoothly. I mean, I'm no geneticist, but trying to work out how Zoom works, I find just as complicated. So thank you so much. And I do hope, as president of the Prehistoric Society, I do hope that you'll follow our events, and I hope you'll follow the rest of the Being Human events. So thank you, everyone. I think we've got to 9 o'clock. It's been a great evening. Thanks to everyone. Good night.
Thank you, Clive. Good.